Hi everyone, Clarissa here. We're going to start a discussion and a series on boundaries. I will be making a video about what to do if your boundaries have been crossed, if you wanted to act in a radical self-responsibility way, and I'll also be looking at why we need boundaries in terms of our spiritual growth. So let's understand what is a boundary. A boundary is kind of really what's okay and what's not okay. We can have boundaries that define our the limits of how we will be at, what we believe, what we will accept and what we won't accept. And this can vary from situation and person to person as well. So some people have got very firm boundaries for themselves, but don't really worry about other people's boundaries. Like there's a difference between my boundary and your boundary. And we're going to have a look at why people develop different forms of boundary systems as well. So boundaries can range from being really non-existent to really rigid and inflexible. And we pretty much learn about boundaries when we are growing up. See, boundaries are not an outspoken thing. They're not something that we actually declare a lot of the times. They're more or less transmitted through our behavior and the way we talk and the way we act and behave and what we will and won't allow other people to do or say to us. So boundaries are formed in our family of origin. That's the family that we grew up in. Parents, relatives, grandparents, whoever had a very strong influence on us when we were younger will have kind of transmitted a general pattern and framework for how we manage our boundaries as we get older. So it's behoving on us really to, as we become adults, to clearly define our boundaries as an adult individual. But when we were children, if we grew up in a family that was what we call in family systems enmeshed or a merged family, so there was a very unclear line between your thoughts, beliefs, feelings and another person's. Maybe there was an intrusion on, what you thought and did, how much privacy you're allowed, which should increase as you get older. So while little kids are little, you really need to be watching them and knowing what they're up to. But as children get older, and certainly as they're in adolescence, the parent needs to know to kind of step back, to allow privacy in their room, to allow them to have their own thoughts, feelings. And a lot of parents, due to their own probably background and upbringing, don't quite get that. So you can end up with very unclear boundaries. And these people can grow up either, in two different ways. They can either overstep other people's boundaries, not quite get it, why another person wouldn't want to do this or that or the next thing, or they can also allow other people to, cross any boundaries they may have easily. So they aren't able to say no. They're not able to be very clear about what they need and want. They can obviously get used and taken advantage of because they're too nice or appeasing. And then you can have families where there are very rigid boundaries. There's a lot of separation. It's almost like there's a wall between where one ends and the other begins. And I find rigid boundaries can also operate on people that have got anxiety disorders. So they need to keep a tight constraint around their world and what happens in it. So the boundaries within a family can be very interrupted and disturbed when there was parents or parent who had alcohol or drug issues, psychological disorders, and particularly personality disorders, because you can kind of step back when you're older and see that perhaps your parent had mental health issues. But if they had a personality disorder, they're often relatively functional, but the way that they manage boundaries is very different from other people. For example, and I'll be talking in the next video, people with narcissistic personality disorder are known to overstep other people's boundaries. And that's because they want what they want. They want their needs met, and their needs are the most important needs. So that shows up as being, well, I don't understand your boundaries. I need this. And also there's a a fragility in the narcissistic person, who often takes a person saying no or that's not okay, that there's a personal insult in that. It's kind of like, why can't I do that? Like, why are you saying no to me? Is there something wrong with me? Are you trying to insult me? So I want to also pinpoint that women and men can have different boundaries based on their gender and sexual identification. Meaning women are brought up, girls are brought up to be sweeter and kinder and to express less anger. So if a woman asserts herself in a boundary, it can often be more difficult, because women are meant to be more conceding and kind and agreeable. And obviously I'm generalizing here, and I'm not saying that's the way anyone should be or that is true for everyone, but it is certainly something that kind of gets socially transmitted at a very subtle level. Whereas it's okay for boys to say no or I want, and to be a little bit more pushy and grabby, because the masculine energy is a little bit more goal-directed and forceful, for want of a better word, in that way. And that's also a more acceptable behavior to come from boys, and the way they are physically and their level of activity. Again, I'm generalizing, and I'm not saying this is the way everyone is. And you can certainly find men that have got more softness around them and that have got looser, more diffuse boundaries, and women who are very strong and assertive and have got strong boundaries. And it also doesn't necessarily have to do with being strong and assertive. Boundaries at the bottom have to do with your ego strength. It's about your sense of identity and who you are and what you are worth. So there's a strong thread of self-worth in being able to set boundaries in a clean and clear and healthy way. As mentioned, some people have got quite rigid boundaries that might protect them from certain things. It might protect their anxiety. It might provide a sense of safety. There are also variations in people that have experienced trauma, where they've had a boundary forcibly crossed, like a real boundary violation between their physical self, their emotional, their psychological self. Trauma and traumatic events do create a sense of instability, particularly around those areas. Let's look at introversion and extroversion. So an introverted person is going to seem like they don't have firm boundaries because they're kind of more quiet, or perhaps come across as being more meek and mild. But it's not actually necessarily true. They can actually have quite a firm sense of what they will and won't do and where they begin and end, but they simply express it in a more subtle, quiet way. Whereas an extroverted person can seem quite confident and brash and sure of themselves, but they may have boundary issues coming from their background, or coming from a low self-worth, or experiences they've had where they'll just sort of let people walk all over them, even though they seem to have the strength to say no, and people kind of expect them to do that. We often take it for granted that if we see someone who's strong and appears confident and strong, that they will tell you when you're overstepping a line, but that's not necessarily the case. So this is really the bottom line of boundaries, is that they are not anywhere written down, like I'll do this and I won't do this and I will do that and I believe in this and I'll accept that and that's okay with me and that's not okay with me. It's something that you need to express somehow, and that other people who are in relationship with you find out in subtle ways. Now, this isn't to say that you can't have a conversation, particularly with someone that you're in a close relationship with, saying, these are my boundaries. Also, ideally asking what are their boundaries. And that exhibits a high level of maturity and respect for the other person. So it's really up to us as we grow older and become more adult, and develop our maturity to understand what is good and what isn't good for us. And we might learn this through experience. So we might think, okay, this is what I like and don't like, or want and don't want in a particular interaction or relationship. And then discover through experience that there's more, or it's different, or it is okay. We decide, or we work out who we are from being in relationship and from experiences. We can also have situations where we shift our boundaries. There might be a boundary in a particular area, say around our time. Some people are very rigid around their time and how long they'll spend with someone and how much of their time they'll waste or give away to other people or things. And they may develop a flexibility for a certain person or for a certain circumstance. So we can maybe go into a situation with a certain boundary and then find that we can let that boundary become more flexible, or we may find that with certain people it needs to become more rigid and firm because we're dealing with someone who doesn't have the same level of understanding or of boundaries, or the same boundaries as us, because our boundaries are our boundaries and another person's is theirs. And as I've explained, there are many different ways that people may have learnt about boundaries or may not have learnt about boundaries. So understanding that having boundaries is a really good, healthy thing to do is important. And understanding what your boundaries are is even more important, because it leads into your ability to maintain your own personal sovereignty and authority. So your boundaries are yours. Nobody else can really define them for you and set them for you, and it's up to you to understand them and to be able to express them in a way that is, clear but okay with other people. So if you're not expressing your boundaries, if you're not establishing boundaries, then not only is it not good for you and your own personal spiritual growth, it's not good for the other person. Because when someone has crossed your boundary, then you end up getting upset. You get a little bit resentful, and that makes that situation not good for either of you. So it's really, I believe, up to the person whose boundaries they are to be clear enough about them to allow the right amount of flexibility within those boundaries, and to be very certain where the line is, that is something acceptable and not acceptable, and to be able to convey that. Now, an essential note to make is that while I'm talking about boundaries getting crossed, I'm talking about transgressions. I'm not talking about violations of personal safety, sexual boundaries, physical boundaries, emotional abuse. I'm not referring to establishing your own boundaries and maintaining them as being your responsibility if somebody comes along and hits you or attacks you or verbally abuses you or directly manipulates you and monopolizes a weakness within you, or those areas which you become very uncomfortable in, or very clearly that there has been an abuse of power. So I just wanted to be really clear about that. But having made that distinction, in the following video, I will talk about how you can manage things and what you can do if you have had your boundary crossed. Given that your boundaries are your delineation between your authority over yourself, they are how you maintain your own power and energy in this world. So when you've sort of had your boundaries crossed and you've been in a way complicit to that, you haven't been very firm and clear about it, then we will look at how you can manage that in the next video. I hope you've even liked this video explaining a little bit more about boundaries and how they operate and how they're formed. If you did, hit like, give my video a like, subscribe if you'd like to hear more from me, and stay tuned for the next video on what to do if your boundary has been crossed and how to take your power and energy back in that situation. Thank you for listening. Namaste.